Okay, well, thank you very much for those wonderful talks, everybody. Maybe I could just ask Paul, now that we have a new emperor in Japan, or newish, and a new king over here, do you think that this is the beginning of a new era in Japan-British relations?
Thank you. I think it's a great era in UK-Japan relations at the moment, and congratulations to the organisers. I think it was a wonderful idea to bring together a discussion of the events of 400 years ago and the events of today. And as someone who was very intimately involved in the negotiations for the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was signed in October 2020, I thought it might be fun just to draw a few similarities and comparisons with the negotiations for the deal back in 1613. Well, obviously the backdrop was pretty similar. In 1613, it wasn't long since England had withdrawn from the European project, or Catholicism as it was known in those days. Henry VIII had been marching around saying to his chums, we must get Protestantism done. And in 1613, we were trying to get the same sort of market access that other Europeans, the Portuguese, the Spanish and the Dutch already had. And rather similarly, in 2020, we were trying to make sure we got at least as good a deal as the EU members already had under the Economic Partnership Agreement, and possibly go a little further in some areas, which fortunately we were able to do. The 1613 agreement was a little less comprehensive. You've seen it on the screen, very simple document. The one we negotiated in 2020 was 1,130 pages in length. The 1613 document, the Shuinjo, was actually still held at the Bodleian Library, but for a number of years it was held, erroneously filed as a Chinese document. I think Jeremy Hunt must have been the librarian. In 1613, the lead negotiator was John Sarris. The results of that negotiation made him a very successful, wealthy man. And in 2020, the lead negotiator, the modern John Sarris, was Liz Truss. And on the back of her successful trade deals, she became Prime Minister. William Adams brought the local knowledge, so I guess he was really the equivalent of us at the British Embassy, helping to explain what the Japanese meant, what they really wanted. And it was particularly important, that role, because in 2020, rather like 1613, COVID meant that travel between the two countries was rather difficult. Of course, trade deals only work if the businesses are able to step into the opportunity and take advantage of it. And I guess Richard Cox, who stayed behind, and his colleagues were like what we call the BCCJ nowadays, the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan, which many of you will know. Cox, as Tim pointed out, was a former spy, so today he's probably working for Hacklet, I think. But of course the deal was not just about trade then as now. The Japanese valued British insights into how the world was operating, and there was also an element of military technology collaboration. Ships then, and nowadays of course it's fighter aircraft. So those are some of the similarities. I've just got time to touch on some of the differences. Well, in 1613 it was mainly about trade in goods. Now it's much more about services, reflecting the modern British economy. Japan in 2020 was at least as interested in the future trade deal that we were negotiating at the same time with the EU as they were in the bilateral deal with Japan, because they wanted to take account of the massive interests of their big investments in the UK. Another difference in 1613, there was no America there, setting the context for the global economic and security scene, or acting as it does today as the major influence internationally on Japan. But China was around. China continued to trade with Japan all through that Sakoku closed period, particularly the Satsuma clan. And I think in 1613, the English and the Japanese probably spent a lot of time talking about China. Certainly today, we spend a lot of time talking about China.
I'll open this up to the audience. I can see a hand already. Would you like to introduce yourself, Sue, and ask your question when you've got the microphone?
Hi. I don't know if that on is. Sue Hudson. I just want to ask you whether you think that Japan values the relationship as much as we obviously do, I mean, we're sitting here, the Japanese have very kindly given us this space, but there are not many Japanese people here as well. Would the embassy in Japan, the British embassy in Japan, be doing something like this as well, trying to strengthen the ties? Certainly the last time I was in Japan, I felt that the position of Britain in the hearts of the Japanese has somewhat diminished. And I think that people like Liz Truss have helped hugely on that matter.
Okay, who would like to?
I'm not going to offer a diplomat's general view, the diplomats could do that, but I definitely think that actually, from the point of view of the defence and security relationship, this matters much more to Japan than it does to Britain, I think is the right way to look at it. That we are not alone in this, we're not unique providers of what we can provide, but what is important, if there was a discussion about defence and security, I think in the embassy in Japan it would definitely be featuring this as a very strong relationship for that field alone.
Well, if I may, from a totally different perspective and a totally different level, I deal with Japanese students and midway students on the exchange in July and August. And I have to say that when the time came that we could no longer do it on the British side, English side, because we were not funded by our council, there was great consternation in Japan, in both Ito and Yokosuka. They were devastated at the thought that this connection would not continue. We had to miss out 1 year because we had no funding. The following year we had to cut down the numbers going each way. I went out there and discussed with them the best way to maintain the exchange, and we agreed that 2 students instead of 4 each year, each way, was a way to maintain it and not cost so much. Then of course COVID came along, and then when we restarted this year, the first time since 2019, we were bailed out by the Momiji Trust, who are very kindly also really brokering the 2024 exchange. But I have to say, when it looked like it was coming to an end at that level, the people in Ito and the people in Yokosuka were very, very disappointed.
If I can, I think from the Japanese side, the means of sustaining the international rules-based order is very high up. You hear senior officials talking about it all the time. And I think here the software which the UK can deploy and is famous for in its political system, in the especially the vigor of civil society, is important, although this country is facing its own problems with respect for international treaties and indeed probity in public life. I think still fundamentally there is a large constituency in Japan, particularly of younger people and those concerned with civil rights, that their country, as I was suggesting in my piece, still has a great deal of knowledge to acquire in this area, and actually there are reforms still to be carried out. If I just mentioned the 2 recent things that have been preying on my mind in Japan, and both of them involve a failure of civil society and particularly press freedom to hold power to account. One is the revelations that were stirred up after the shocking assassination of Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, about what's happening underneath the veil with the corrupt practices and apparent exploitation by the ruling party of special favours to the Unification Church. And this became a big scandal in Japan, but the thing about scandals in Japan, as we saw with the Johnny Kitagawa case as well, is that they don't catch fire. They come from Gaiatsu. In fact, it was a BBC documentary program, as you remember, that did that. But they don't catch fire. When I was in Japan in May, again, there was a great deal of concern among Japanese lawyers when Human Rights Watch published its damning report on hostage justice, as they called the Japanese system of justice, where very nearly 100% of prosecutions end up in conviction, pre-trial detention almost indefinite, lack of trial, and confidence in the system. Now, if Japan and the UK together are going to present to the outside world what it means to have a rules-based order, an accountable society, not to be accused of hypocrisy, we have to tackle these things. I think that's the point that I was making about the delay that was caused by the Tokugawa regime. So here we have a rich seam of common interest, and the forums like the Japan Society at a professional level, but also at government level, the Japan-UK 21st Century Group, ought to be tackling these things in order to present a convincing front to the global south and others who are not convinced. Thank you.
I just got a small point to answer Sue Hudson's question about Japanese participation. And I should mention that Sue played an absolutely crucial role on the executive of Japan 400 in the busiest period, 2013, 2014. At that time we had more than 220 events, either a core number of events in key venues in Japan as well as in Britain, organized by the Inner Circle, but also other events which were under our logo, under our banner, and moving in the same direction. The reason, and so Tim Screech mentioned that at Nijo Castle, the Shogun's Castle in Kyoto, last month, there was a ceremony and meeting and permanent unveiling of benches, planting of trees as a Japan 400 event in Japan, at which there were many more Japanese than British people. This time, I'm afraid I have to take the blame, but there are many more British people than Japanese because I wanted to find a way of thanking and involving many of the British people who took part in the big push in 2013, 2014. There was, I think, a huge interest on the part of Japanese. A third of the places today were given to the Japan Society to hand out, and there were many Japanese who have come through that route as well. I wish we'd had more room, but we were absolutely at capacity, and that's why there aren't more, but there was no lack of interest.
Yes, I just wanted, if I may, just to add also to Sue's question, that I think that if this gathering were held in Japan, that there would be at least as much interest and support. I think there's huge enthusiasm in Japan for our UK-Japan relationship. And many people are now talking about it as the second Anglo-Japanese alliance. And even Mete Minister Nishimura, at his speech at the IISS recently, called it the second Anglo-Japanese alliance for innovation, which was a slight variation and made the new one broader than purely a military concept.
Can I think, let's be honest, the two countries that matter most to Japan are China and the US. China becoming increasingly adversarial, the US trending increasingly isolationist, and so Japan wants to bring in others. They include regional power like Australia, future superpower like India, and Europeans such as the UK. I think the Japanese would see the UK as having very specific skill sets to bring to the peace, in navies, for example, in particular high technologies and intelligence, and for that reason we remain very important, but in those specific areas and as part of a wider context.
I think Paul puts it in absolutely the right context there. And Sue, I think the answer to your question is, to be frank, I suspect that Japan 400 means more to a British audience than it does to a Japanese audience. And there are obvious reasons why that would the case. Which is not to say that there isn't a high level of affection and respect in Japan for the relationship in all the areas that we've talked about. But I do think diplomats, or people discussing diplomatic relationships, need to be very careful about believing their own propaganda. Diplomacy is about a country's interests as well as its values. And the art of diplomacy is about ensuring, as you build a relationship with another country, that your interests are combining in a way that is win-win and produces something positive for both sides. As successive British and Japanese governments have done with great success, I think, over the last 50 years, initially in the trade and investment field, as you and others have said, and increasingly in the political and defence and broader relationship. But I do think that William's point about values needs to be listened to attentively by a British political audience. I'm not privileged to see the Japanese embassy's telegrams reporting on British politics, or any foreign embassy's telegrams reporting on British politics, but if I were, I would not be surprised to see a high level of concern about the way in which an increasingly nationalistic set of populist politicians are beginning to drive coaches and horses through the idea of international legal obligations. The one thing which defines Japan in the modern world is a high level of attachment to one's legal obligations. That is something which I always think of as culturally extremely specific to successive Japanese governments. I would be very worried about the casual way in which we are beginning to trash these values in the UK under the present government.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up at this point. It's getting rather late. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the day. And can we please have a big hand for all our speakers? Do please stay. We're going to have a chance to raise a glass or two to William Adams and those doughty Brits who manned
And John
the
Sarris.
factory. Before we finish, I'm going to ask Nicolas Maclean of Pennycross to give us the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Lesley. I know that I'm between you and our sake samurai sushi reception, and it's all ready for you. So I just want to say a huge thank you to the Japanese ambassador, Ambassador Hayashi, to Minister Matsura, who may well be connected to the daimyo of Hirado, who originally welcomed the British in 1613. I also want to thank the Minister for Culture and Information, Mr. Okazaki, who has played an absolutely crucial role in this conference taking place, and his extremely able First Secretary, Ms. Shimokawa Mayuko. Thank you for everything. Kokoro kara. Makoto ni. And they're backed by a very active and able team led by Mark McAvoy. I cannot tell you all the detail and the complications that have led to this very, very smooth running, but they deserve an enormous thank you, as do the sponsors, as well as the Embassy of Japan, very major sponsor, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, who also gave enormous help throughout this celebration since 2013, as did Sake Samurai at many crucial places, both in London and around the country for some of our local events. And I hope they'll be there on the 17th of March in Staffordshire when we remember 400 years since the death of Cox at sea in the Indian Ocean, where the Bishop of Lichfield, one of the members of our advisory council, will be officiating. The only Japanese-speaking bishop in Britain. We also have to thank the Japan Society, not only for the presence of many key people here today, but also for their financial support. And the East India Company, so often mentioned throughout the course of today, especially in the first half of the conference, will be in your thoughts as you leave, because everyone leaving, I think, has had the benefit of one of the party bags with some of the best products of the East India Company today. So we're delighted that the chairman of the East India Company, now Indian-owned, and the chief archivist, and also their special advisor, the former governor of St. Helena, have all been with us today. And finally, a very special friend of a number of us here, one of my oldest friends in Japan, Nagayama Osamu, former chairman of Chugai Pharmaceutical and of the Sony Group, and with many other influential hats in Japan. He has been immensely generous, individually, as well as when he had corporate budgets to dispose of, in allowing for the success of Japan 400, because like all good things in life, goodwill is important, but money does have a role. Thank you all very much indeed for coming.